suddenly all these women jumped up with their babies and they were just ecstatic, you know, and they were la 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 la, doing all this amazing singing, and I was like, far out, thank you for giving me that story, you know, thank you for reminding me in that moment that I do have a place here.
Hey, I'm Ange.
And I'm Beck.
And we are the Gold Diggers, because we believe there's gold found in everyone.
Everyone is unique, interesting and exciting with a great story to share.
And we aim to find it.
The question is, can we rise to the challenge and strike gold?
I need your my sugar.
So you know when you've been around people a lot in your life, but you haven't actually delved deep into their history. Well, this podcast today is someone that both Beck and I know. And we looked into his history and we both found some surprises, didn't we?
We definitely did. And I didn't know that Stu had so many near-death experiences.
And he's a sucker for adventure.
Absolutely.
Lived in 4 different countries.
And on the hunt for the story.
And, is a photographer, filmmaker. So there's so many aspects to this podcast.
We could have gone on and on, really.
I reckon we could have had 3 episodes.
I think so too.
So it's a fascinating story and some really interesting parts of his life that you really don't get to hear in normal life. So check it out.
I need your my sugar.
So this is how it works. One of us knows our mystery guest and the other one doesn't. And it's up to the one who doesn't to discover the gold in our secret guest. So today, actually, you have met our guest and you do know a lot about him. But there's some interesting facts that I think you don't know about him. So today's guest is Stu Harris.
Yes.
Stu runs a marketing company and actually deals with all the marketing for the Gold Diggers. They're called story strategists. So that's what you do know.
Yes.
But here's some fun facts for you, Beck. So he's lived in 4 different countries.
Right.
He's had 3 near-death experiences.
Wow. Yes.
And he's also a filmmaker.
Right.
So,
yes.
So let's see what gold you can dig, and let's bring in Stu.
Woo!
Welcome. Woo!
Welcome to the show, Stu.
Thank you.
So welcome, Stu. Good to have you in the studio.
Thank you, Ange.
How does it feel being in front of the camera?
Yeah, it's surreal. It's very strange being this side.
Yeah,
a little bit terrified, just to say. But,
Oh, you'll relax. It's all good. You're with friends.
Yes.
And we have known each other for quite some time. But there are obviously some things I don't know about you. Like, for instance, your near-death experiences as well. So we're going to delve into that
Isn't that the
today.
case so often with people? Like you
Yes.
can be around them for years, you can know what they do, you can interact with them, but actually, do we ever really delve into somebody's history? And so that's what's exciting about this podcast, because you've got a very interesting history.
Yes, and I'd really like to know more about your life before I met you, because I know little bits, but I probably don't know a lot about that. So let's go back. Ange said that you've lived in 4 different countries. So my guess is that you were born in the UK. Is that correct?
The accent's a bit of a giveaway.
It is.
I know.
But you could have the accent and be born in a different country.
Yeah, I call it a speech impediment, just to kind of soften the blow with my Aussie friends, so they don't sort of rip into me straight away.
Yeah, I think Aussies like the English accent, so
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
You
get
sound
away
more
with it.
English than me. You're more pommy than me.
It's probably because I got that sort of southern English accent
Yeah,
as
you've got
well,
the
so I
proper
sound
English.
a bit posh,
Yeah.
maybe.
Which part of England were you born?
Well, I was born in Reading in Berkshire. I've never actually, in fact, I think I've only spent a couple of nights in my entire life asleep in Berkshire, and that would have been when I was born. But I think my accent probably comes more from when I lived overseas in Hong Kong, because I was surrounded by international students, and typically what happens is you kind of take a bit of lots of different people's voices and accents, and sort of they kind of rounds off the rough edges and lifts certain bits up and so on.
Like an international accent.
So I'd like to say that I'm like an international man of mystery.
Oh, yes, 007. Is that right?
It's really fitting for you,
I'll
Stu.
go with that. Yes, it may well be.
Harris. Stu Harris.
I like that. I like
He does
that.
kind of fit the Bond thing.
It does, yeah.
So, say Reading.
Yes, Reading in Berkshire. Never lived there, like I said.
Right.
But we were from the southwest of London, basically. If you sort of 40 minutes out of London, southwest, that's the sort of area that I grew up in. It's a really hard question, though, to answer. You know, people often say to me, where are you from? And I'll actually say my response is Guildford, which is in Surrey, which is not that far. It's about a 40-minute drive from Reading, where I was born. But I actually lived in Guildford only for a few years when I was an adult. But it's just a whole lot easier to answer in a quick, you know, when someone's asking for a quick response, like, oh, whereabouts are you from? When they say, oh, you're English. Because we never really settled for very long in one particular place. And that was because as my dad progressed in his career, he worked at Heathrow Airport. He was in aviation. There he was an air safety officer there when I was a child, right up till the age of about 12. And we moved 3 times during, you know, those early years, kind of initially closer to his job at Heathrow Airport, and then later we moved further out to Sandhurst in Berkshire. And but as I said, we were only really ever in one place for more than about 4 or 5 years before we moved to the next house. So up until the age of 12, and then we moved overseas. And so, in fact, the funny thing is, where I live right now, with, you know, my wife and children, is the longest house I've ever lived in the town. That's the longest I've ever lived anywhere in the world.
How many years have you lived there?
11 years.
Wow.
So it's pretty
I
strange.
can totally relate to that because we moved a lot as kids. My parents are pastors. But did you ever find it very, what's the word?
Unsettling?
Yeah, unsettling?
Well, I guess the thing is, I never really knew any different. But there's definitely a part of my origin story, if you like. I think now, as I look back, you know, so far, because I still think I've got quite some way to go. But, you know, it definitely helps to understand, you know, why I think the way I do, why I settle in places the way I do, why I like connecting with people quite easily the way I do, because when you move a lot, you have coping mechanisms, right? You have to kind of figure out how to make friends quickly, how to settle quickly, how to navigate quickly, how to orientate yourself quickly around different things. And that's especially true when you move into different cultures. I mean, it's true even in Britain, you know, the joke in the UK is you have to cross the street and you get a different accent. You know, so you can kind of like zero in on where somebody comes from just based on the slightly different nuanced accent that they have. But I'd say when you move overseas, it's a whole different thing. Like when you are a minority in a country, not to say, you know, so, you know, living in Hong Kong, for example, or in Malta, as I did, and Singapore as well, that later on, these kind of countries all come with their own different cultures, and kind of, you know, sort of, I don't want to say rules, you know, of engagement or anything silly like that, but, you know, they come with the cultural things, and you know, being an expat in those places, being I guess a child and then later an adult in those environments, you see the world. You're not entirely immersed in those cultures, but you're kind of bumping into those cultures, and they help shape you and give you a more informed picture of the world, or the world that you live in.
So if your accent really was formed in an international community within Hong Kong, so did you actually really experience the Hong Kong culture, or were you kind of in a bubble?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Expats?
I mean, I'd like to say that I, you know, didn't necessarily live in a bubble. I mean, it was probably a bubble, but it may be a slightly bigger bubble than. And I think as I said, when your question before, Beck, about what shaped me in terms of, like, you know, was it unsettling? I think I have a sense of curiosity. I love people, cultures, traveling, and I'm sure that this will come out in some of the things that I share. But I think that's helped shape who I am. I think I like to get outside of the bubble. I don't want to be naive. I experience things through the kind of culture that I come from, you know, all those sorts of things. But I feel like I probably go a little bit further than, you know, a slightly bigger bubble. I know it sounds a little bit abstract.
You want to push the boundaries and experience different cultures.
Yeah, because I enjoy it. And actually, I like the challenge and the stretching, and I want to understand better. It's a curiosity kind of thing, and I think it makes, it's just, I guess, who I enjoy being is somebody who's curious about the world, about people, about place, and those sorts of things.
So how old were you when you were in Hong Kong?
Well, I left the UK when I was 12,
Yeah.
so in the early 80s, and we actually, it's quite funny because so Dad, this is going to sound crazy, right? And my dad, my parents, I should say, it's not just my dad, because of course my mum was a big part of the decision that they made, which was to basically sell the house, buy a yacht, and sail from the UK to Hong Kong.
Wow.
The reason you might be thinking, well, why Hong Kong? It seems like a very strange destination. Why wouldn't you go to the Caribbean
I
or
was
whatever?
just thinking that. Yeah.
I know. I'm preempting your
just-
question
yeah.
for you, Beck.
Thank you.
Yeah. So basically, the reason was we had family in Hong Kong. So
Yeah.
my mum's sister was and still is in Hong Kong. And so I've got cousins there. We were very, very close. Obviously, my mum and her sister were very, very close. And they used to see and talk a lot, and see a lot of each other when she would come back to the UK. And I guess my mum just got that sense of like, wow, I really want to go and live there. And Hong Kong in the early 80s was very different to what it looks like now. And it was still a colony of Britain, a colonial city, I should say, of Britain. And it was incredibly different politically, socially, culturally than it is today. So the story is we sold up the house in the UK. I was young. I didn't really know all the details, but I didn't get on the boat from the UK to Malta, which was our stopping off point en route. But because my dad chartered out the yacht, and we met him in Malta when they arrived there. I was obviously in high school, so my early grade 1, grade 2 of high school, which would be like grade 7 or 8 in Aussie terms. So when my parents decided it would be best for us, my brother and I, to fly to Malta, go to school in Malta, and we'd stay there for a year and then move on to Hong Kong. We wanted to wait for the right. There's a certain time of the year when you should travel through the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're kind of going against the tide, literally.
Yeah. And was it easy for your dad to pick up his work and locate it in another place?
Not really. And this is where, I'll just be really brief and try not to, it's my dad's story to tell, but, my mum used to share a lot of her frustrations, I guess, with, maybe my dad and their relationship. My mum and I were really close. And my dad would sometimes, I guess, do things a bit impulsively without necessarily great lengths of planning. So to be practical and give you an example, the decision to go to Malta, I guess this is pre-internet, right? So nowadays we just Google it, Malta, what's it like living there? Where, it was actually really hard because they had a socialist government. It was pre-EU, turned up there, he couldn't work. So it meant that any yacht chartering we did in Malta actually had to come from bringing the business from overseas into Malta. We couldn't poach for local business from within Malta. Whereas today, if you're in Malta and you're a British passport holder, or which is probably technically different again because of Brexit, but if things were different, things would be different now because they're a member of the EU and everything's just different. But it was hard then. So what that meant was actually the business collapsed. So in 12 months they lost. They had a business partner. He turned out to be a bit of a rat bag and basically took a lot of money from my parents. They had to sell up. They took what they had. Rather than going back to the UK with their kind of tail tucked between their legs, they decided, let's just go to Hong Kong anyway. So they basically, that's the sanitized short version of the story. There was, so anyway, we went to Hong Kong and started a new life there.
So you were in the boat when you sailed from Malta to Hong Kong?
No, we sold the boat in Malta.
You sold it.
Yeah, we sold everything in Malta. So we never actually ended up sailing from Malta to Hong Kong. We did quite a lot of sailing in the Mediterranean, during that year. In fact, the summer holidays were some of my favorite memories as a child because, we'd stay in Gozo and then go across to Camino and just some of the most beautiful swimming and snorkeling. And I spent the entire school holidays just basically in the water.
Wow.
I'm surprised I didn't end up
With
shriveled.
gills.
Or with gills, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or burnt to a crisp.
Yeah, they're great memories of mine.
So you really had to rebuild from scratch in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, as a 12, 13-year-old, I didn't really fully appreciate it. I think the thing that impacted me more was the relationship between my mum and my dad. It was definitely at its lowest at that point. In fact, what I didn't tell you is that my dad was, in fact, he took on a yacht delivery job, delivering a boat from the UK to Malta for a client. And during that time, the boat, we weren't in contact with him, of course, because again, pre-iPhone, pre-internet. He was just doing the job as far as we were concerned. My aunt came to visit us. My mum and my aunt really had a lot of deep and meaningfuls, obviously, realised my mum shared with my aunt that things aren't great. And my aunt and my mum on the fly, I guess, over a few days decided, let's just go now. So we literally packed up everything and left. So when my dad finally arrived in Malta,
You weren't there.
we weren't there. There was a
Yeah,
letter basically saying, listen, we've left. It's up to you to decide how you deal with everything, the boat and with things going forward. But we're here. We're going to be in Hong Kong. Join us. Join us when you can. And I guess there was a condition in there attached as well, like depending on how you want to go going forward. I mean, again, I was 12, 13, so I didn't really have a lot of understanding, but my mum was very open with me. She would share like her struggles. We would have lots of like conversations. She tried to reason and help me understand what was going on, which was helpful. But I could see, in hindsight, I know that was a very dark time for my mum, really difficult for her. But we went there, and my uncle and aunt in Hong Kong were incredibly kind to us. They opened up their home. We lived with them for a few months until we got our own place in Hong Kong and started a new life.
Right. So what decision did your dad then make? Did he follow you there?
Yeah, he did. He sold the boat first and then moved, to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So it was a few months we were apart, but it was great when we were united again. It was amazing. There was a great amount of healing that happened between my mum and my dad. My dad had shown a real commitment to sort of, dealing with the situation. It felt like they were sort of flying by the seat of their pants a bit, if you like, beforehand, and that would have been terribly unsettling for my mum.
Yeah.
Someone needed to take leadership, and I think it was the kick up the butt that my dad needed to do that.
Pull it all into shape.
So how long were you in Hong Kong for?
All the way through my high schooling years. So I basically finished high school in Hong Kong, and then made the decision on my own, pretty much, to go back to the UK to do further education, which, I was 17. Now I've got a 17-year-old now, and I'm thinking, I look at him and I think, I can't believe I made this decision when I was your age.
Yeah.
And I can't believe, more to that point, that my parents let me go.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Hong Kong and the education system I was in, it was an English school, private school in in Hong Kong, and it was very academic. I mean, but I had a creative sort of
Flair.
I love creativity. In fact, I excelled in photography, and I knew that I wanted to do something in the creative arts, and particularly in photography.
Yeah.
And I knew I couldn't do that I couldn't get any further in high school in Hong Kong, so I started looking at options in the UK. Which is why I basically said to my parents, look, the best thing I can do is go to the UK. Will you help me? So,
So what did you study in the UK then?
Well, so I didn't know until I actually got there, because I really didn't know what was going to be available to me. I just had a bit of a sense of what I probably should go and look for. I just knew I wanted to be a photographer. That was what I knew. I had seen a presentation in Hong Kong where a National Geographic photographer had done this fantastic presentation in a theatre, and I was like, that's it. I want to do what he does.
Yeah.
I want to travel the world, take photographs of, people in different situations in the world. I want to shoot like that guy does.
They're amazing photographs in National Geographic, aren't they?
Yeah, and it was, again, in an era pre-digital, right? We're talking film, and the world was very different. You could be a photographer. You can be a photographer today, but it was easier to make a career out of photography if you were very creative. If you were qualified if you were good at
Well,
taking
everyone's
photographs.
a photographer now, aren't
That's
they,
the
with their
thing.
iPhones?
Yeah, well, they say the best camera is the one in your pocket, and the truth is that the camera that I carry in my pocket, my phone, takes, arguably good as well, possibly even better quality photographs than the camera that I owned at the time, back in when I left for the UK.
Yeah.
But it's really not about the camera; it's about the composition and everything else that you do and the story that you tell in the frame.
Yes. And having the eye, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, you were limited to 36 frames, so it meant that when you click the button, you didn't have a chance to look at the back of the camera afterwards. You just basically you composed the image in your mind. You took the shot rather, but you didn't know for sure whether you got the shot until you actually exposed the images later.
Because your photography has actually taken you to some unusual places, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, it always has, and even now, I mean, it sounds obvious to people when you introduce me as, I've got our own marketing agency, and you can see there's definitely a creative journey throughout my life. But photography itself has taken me to, like you say, to a lot of places. But that wasn't necessarily until later. I had so we're kind of jumping a little bit, but I guess, having studied in the UK, I actually, when I graduated from art school, so I actually did like a fine arts diploma and national diploma in the UK before pursuing a degree. And that meant that I actually wanted to do sort of something more in the fine arts and photography space, but rather than necessarily like commercial photography. I tried fashion photography and various other things, and I was an apprentice for a little while doing that too. But I really felt like I wanted to do something more in the fine arts space. As it happened, after I graduated, I went and lived with my parents in Singapore. They'd moved from Hong Kong to Singapore, and I spent about a year and a half or so living there, working as a photographer, ironically a commercial photographer, shooting architecture and all sorts of different things, whatever anybody would pay me to shoot that was legal, and kind of needed to make money to survive, and then I would go traveling with my savings and take photographs out and about, like in Indonesia and in Malaysia. That were traveling and just had a fantastic time traveling. Just
sounds amazing. You would have seen some amazing things.
That was fun. It was definitely fun.
Yeah.
You went to Africa, didn't you? You did this Heal Africa. You put all your photography in a book.
That's right. Yeah, that was kind of I kind of call it the sort of positive interruption in my kind of career journey. And what I mean by that is that, I'd set out to be a photographer, but I accidentally ended up working for Apple. And I know people probably listening are thinking, far out, you ended up working for like one of the coolest companies in the world. Well, let me just remind you, in the late 90s, Apple was not the coolest company. I mean, it was making interesting things, but it was, I always say, 6 weeks from going out of business. I was absolutely mesmerized by the company. I loved what it did. And obviously I was,
was
using
this in
a
the
Mac.
States?
No, this is in the UK.
UK, okay.
Yeah, and so I loved the company. I loved the fact that it was, I'm not really into computers. I was just really into the fact that this was a tool to help me as a photographer or as a creative. And so the Apple computer, the Mac platform was obviously the tool of choice, as the computer industry was emerging and sort of intersecting with the creative arts. And I was mesmerized. I discovered the inner geek in me, and the fact that I could communicate technical things to people who were creative, which is quite challenging, right? And that's because I was a creative myself. And so during my career at Apple, 8 of those years were in the UK, and then that's what moved us to Australia. Apple actually transferred me to here, to Australia. I was, for 13 years employed by Apple and a couple of years by the distributor. So 15 years all up, I basically was having the time of my life, literally being paid really well, traveling, having a fantastic time, got to see some great places, working with some of the most incredible, like visionary creatives, like filmmakers, photographers, musicians. Got some insane stories of people I got to work with, visual effects artists from all over the world on movies, music that you would have heard, that you know from the, just incredible opportunities to work directly with,
And you
with
met
some
Steve
of the best
Jobs
creatives.
too, didn't you?
I've had a few encounters, with Steve. I the funny thing is I always try to avoid him.
Well, it's easy to do now.
Well, it is to do now. Yeah, I mean, I saw him right up to the last few weeks before he passed away. I remember seeing the transformation in his physique, as he was getting more and more ill. But the thing is, he was a genius. But he was also there was a lot of kind of, let's say, were they urban myths? I don't know, but they were definitely stories that us as employees would be fearful of. Like getting into an elevator with Steve was like, nobody does that because that may be your last day at Apple. If you get encounter him, right? So I had a couple of times I had to work with him on some things, and so I'd just try and keep a low profile. Which was at times challenging, but that in itself is probably a whole podcast to talk about. But it was heaps
sounds
of fun.
interesting.
Yeah. It was really cool, and I was, I think the privilege in that was being able to have a front row seat to literally listening, and that's the key thing, not speaking but listening.
Yeah.
So I think some of the, probably one of the most influential business people that we've had in our lifetime, and I got to hear that off camera. I got to hear that myself in conversation at this kind of proximity, and that shaped a lot of my thinking. So a lot of my strategic thinking and my business acumen comes from those 15 years or so of working with Apple.
Wow.
But yeah, as I said, there's this kind of intersection between creative and business. And the Africa piece, just to get to your answer, sorry, I kind of go on a bit. Essentially, there was an interruption in my thinking, is the best way I could think of it, describe it. The way I describe it to people normally is, it's like I fell out of love with Apple. Right. So, the way I like to talk about it is, you imagine like when you were dating somebody, back in the day, and you were trying, and you realize, oh gosh, I'm not really sure I like that person, and, maybe I shouldn't be dating them. And, you suddenly feel that awkward feeling. That's kind of how it felt.
So you had to disconnect from it.
I had suddenly had this weird disconnection, and I've thought about it a lot, and I think it was just a very peculiar feeling, and I sort of tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. And now I understand it better. I think as I was sort of from a faith perspective, especially leaning into that moment and sort of really questioning myself, asking, what is this feeling? What is it I'm feeling discomfort for? And it wasn't because I didn't like the company or I didn't like what they were doing. They were doing great things. It was actually essentially me realizing that I had now an opportunity to step out of this particular chapter into a new season, and that new season would be for me. And the sense I had was, now's the time for you to step back into a creative role, right? Not just to work with creatives and help them, but actually to be the creative and drive the story. And that was like both terrifying and really exciting at the same time.
Because you would have had a lot of security in Apple, wouldn't you?
Oh, heaps.
So to step out of that's a big risk, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, foolish, some would say, because, I guess financially, I look at my friends who still are either there or actually a number of them are retired. They're, sort of my age and, enjoying life and driving fast cars and
Living on their yachts,
which is ironic because I'm like, would love a 36-foot yacht, and that's always the joke amongst our family. It's like, when are we getting the yacht? But anyway, my values had changed. It wasn't about striving for success in that regard. I'm still interested in succeeding, but it wasn't about trying to be, to have monetary success and I enjoyed the engagement with those other creators, but I felt like I had a story that I needed to tell. I had stories actually, and that's where the book. So I had an opportunity that kind of came up for me I went on a missions trip overseas in Indonesia. So this is the pre-Africa bit. But basically what happened is I finished this mission trip and I've been doing photographs for the charity that I was supporting. And at the end, it was like a voice. I sensed this feeling of, this is what I want you to do next. And I was like, what that's, and it was all connected to that, like falling out of love with Apple story in that, in that sense. And
you're entering a new season.
yeah, I was like, wow, what's that? So it kind of was another little add-on to, okay, I'm starting to see a picture here. It's starting to become a little bit more visible. It was like looking through fog and then starting to see a little clearer that, there's some shapes there. And those shapes were coming clearer to me. And there were things like, okay, I'm going to step into a season of being creative, telling stories. So I was shooting this, essentially a photographic documentary book about a community in Indonesia that were in extreme poverty and how they had essentially helped themselves out of poverty and how others had supported them and come alongside to help them. And I just realized when I'd completed that project and people were delighted with it, I was like, wow, this is exciting. I'm shooting stories about people, and it's going to have hopefully an impact in helping transform their lives because they're telling their story. They're given a voice. And I suddenly realized that's that feeling I had when I was like 16 or 17 when I was like, I want to be a National Geographic photographer. It was the same feeling. It was a reconnection to that original idea, except now I'm much older. I'm a little bit wiser. I've got experience, and I've got some credibility and some understanding of how to actually get the job done. And that later led to a much bigger project, which was probably one of those near-death experiences, by the way.
Oh, yeah. So we need to hear about that.
Yeah. And that was going to the DRC, to going to the Congo and shooting a story about a remarkable hospital in Goma in the DRC and about what they do there.
Right. Tell us more.
Yeah. So tell us your
Let's go
near-death
into that.
experiences.
Well,
Yes.
when I say near death, I mean, I went to one of the most dangerous cities in the world, and that in itself is basically the thing. I mean, you can't go there today as a foreigner. It's incredibly hard unless you're a member of the UN or you've got some sort of military reason to be there. But as a member of the public, it's just you can't go. You're not allowed to go.
What did it look like for you?
Well, in terms of we went in through Rwanda, and for me, the way I describe it, walking across, it took us several hours to actually get, even though we had permission, it still took time to actually get the permission validated, and we walked across the 100 meters or so through no man's land into the Congo, and it was like walking from daylight into nighttime in terms of there was like a sense of, this is a completely different place. Like it was, and that's why I say it's like day and night. It was like, going from breathing fresh air to jumping in the ocean and holding your breath. It was so tangibly different. The atmosphere there, the people's faces, there was no expression, like everything had been just sucked out of them. And I've come to realize, as somebody who loves photographing people, I think people are the most interesting thing to photograph because you can tell a story about the environment that they live in, everything just through their eyes. And so seeing these people devoid of this look, this kind of characteristic of humanity that you just see in everybody, life gone in these people, was terrifying. It's
and this is because they've been through war.
They've been through generation after generation after generation of complex, horrific, terrifying stuff. I mean, it's just so complex and that it's unbelievable. The more you start to learn about the story, you realize, wow, gosh, there's another layer of that. It's brutal. It's brutal, and you can't. I was only there for a week shooting the story, and yet you can't go there and not be affected. It just hit me like like night and day.
And as a creative behind the camera, sometimes just those images or facial expressions you capture so much, can't you? In those moments?
Absolutely. I mean, it was honestly, it was like in some ways it was exciting because I could point the camera almost in any direction, and I would capture something that's incredibly unique and interesting. But the thing is, shooting as a documentary photographer comes with a great privilege. It's a great privilege, but it's also you have to be incredibly sensitive. And I spent a few years earlier than that. I was on a shoot with a photographer who shoots for like Time and a bunch of different magazines, and I actually commissioned him or paid him essentially to travel with him for just a week and ask questions and understand what it is that makes you basically a documentary photographer. How do you do that? What sets you apart? How do you capture these stories? And he taught me a lot. But one of the things I really took away was this sense of time. You can't just point a camera in front of somebody's face and ask permission later. Well, you can, but to really capture somebody's story, you have to stay with them a while. You have to not walk in their shoes, but you need to live with them for a while, literally. Spend time. When you're on an assignment for a week, that's really, really hard to do. You've got to fast track some things to get there.
Because they've got to allow you in, don't they?
Absolutely. So that's hard to do. But it was something that I was practicing. It's like drawing. You keep practicing the same strokes over and over, and you'll get better at them. I had to keep putting myself in that environment where I could actually dwell with somebody or with the subject, understand their environment, and therefore get a better image.
Did you ever feel a threat?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very dangerous environment. So there was this one moment when I was out shooting a story with a photographer. I won't mention her name, but she's an ABC journalist at the time. Anyway, and she was shooting a story there as well. And so we decided to buddy up for safety reasons. And we also were going to the same area, so it made sense. We got out of the vehicle. Well, before we got out of the vehicle, we just kind of agreed on our tactics, like what we're going to do. I'm going to go there, you're going to go there, we're going to do this, and then we're going to get back in the car and go. Because it was literally the minute someone sees a white vehicle, looks like a UN vehicle or that kind of thing, they know that you're a foreigner. And basically that means I don't like you. You betrayed us over and over again, and so on. So you get the idea, and they've got that. Yeah, so we basically pulled up. I had maybe a minute, literally, to get out of the vehicle, get to the location where I could stand and take the photograph that I needed. Because I was just doing stills. She was doing video, pieces to camera. And so I was the other side of the street from her. Within about literally a minute, we had about 200 or 300 people surrounding us, shouting at us, pointing at us in broken English, demanding our papers. We had like 2 or 3 different men basically claiming to be figures of authority, which we knew was a lie because there's no military as such. There wasn't at the time that was authorized. It was just people kind of finding a uniform and claiming to be military, and sort of making up things like, oh, we need your papers. Well, they didn't have papers. It just was, a farce in that sense, but it was also incredibly aggressive, quite worrying, because, not just because we've got expensive equipment around us, but more that we're worried about our lives, because people people were getting shot all the time there. And the stories, there are just so many stories of people, Westerners as well, right? White people.
Sounds very volatile.
Hugely volatile.
How did you get out of that situation?
You have to being worldly wise, streetwise in that kind of environment is very different to just walking down, a street of a capital city and just not going down certain streets. You're in that street, everywhere is that street. And so you have to just know how to basically be bigger than you are, and you take authority. And just act immediately. There's no kind of negotiating. There's just immediate, this is what's happening, I'm going, we're done. And just do it.
Wow.
And it's incredible. And like, the feeling of like, the adrenaline and you get back in the vehicle. I mean, we were chatting about this afterwards and it was like, wow, gosh, can you believe what just happened? You know what? This was not really my environment. I don't spend all of my time in those situations. The person that I was traveling with, she's an award-winning photographer and filmmaker. And honestly, even in those few days that we spent together, and on that particular occasion, I learned so much. And she, by the way, was later, when we left each other, she took her very expensive camera and heavy Miller tripod, courtesy of, I don't know whether it was the ABC or whatever, and she was covering a news story. She had to go and sleep rough on the streets to catch this story in the neighboring city that she had to travel to. And she had to get there on roads that were like impassable. Like she had to go through checkpoints, and it's a miracle that she actually even survived it, to be honest with you. But that's what, news journalists do. You can't even imagine the things that they have to go through to catch the stories that we watch on the news.
You got to have the hunger for it, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I got a little glimpse of that. I'm not saying that's me. I'm just saying that's just sometimes I've had to learn very quickly of how to live in that world.
Seems like life-threatening experiences are quite commonplace for you, though, Stu.
Well, only because the other ones are more just travel experiences. I do love adventure, so I like climbing mountains, and I'm not a mountaineer, but I'll put myself in vulnerable situations. And there's been a couple of times when friends of mine and I that I've traveled with, we've just been in those moments of like, oh my goodness, we are completely out of our depth right now. And honestly, so I won't go into the details, but snowstorms, blizzards in Scotland, and actually here in Australia as well, in Tasmania. The Cradle Mountain National Park, got caught out in a storm there with a friend as well. And you might think, oh, big deal, Cradle Mountain National Park. Thousands of tourists go there all the time. But actually, we ended up finding shelter in this hut. And we had one match, literally. Miraculously made a fire in this little fire that they had in the hut. Survived the night fine. We had to dry all of our clothes out. We were, like I said, completely drenched, freezing cold. Anyway, and the next day when we could actually see, because we didn't really have much light, there was actually a plaque on the wall commemorating the loss of 30-something students that had died in this area, and the teacher as well that was walking with them, and only one student survived, and that was the student that was being covered by the teacher that saved this person's life. And we were like, okay, so maybe we don't feel so bad about the fact that we really struggled last night in this storm. It happens to other people too.
And sailing as well.
Well, I because the connection with my dad and sailing, and our family, we love being in the ocean. You do find yourself in big storms. And I've been in a lot of storms in the ocean, and being out in the middle of the ocean, like days away from land, is something that most people don't experience. Maybe on a cruise ship, but that's not the same as being on a yacht, like where you're really vulnerable. And so I've probably the most recent example. I've delivered yachts and stuff around with friends around Australia, but we did the Sydney to Hobart a few years back. That was a bucket list item. Huge privilege to do that. But we came out of Sydney Heads, hit a massive southerly buster, which is renowned in for anyone living in Sydney and the south of New South Wales will know them well. These big southerly storms that just come up from the south, and we hit this thing 40-50 knots of wind. Smashed into it for about 5 or 6 hours, and it was terrifying. For hours I'm sitting on the edge of the rail, freezing cold, like southerly ocean blasting into my face like icicles, thinking, you wouldn't normally choose to go into a storm like this, but I had to keep reminding myself, this is a race, this is what you do. Whereas normally in my sailing career, it's, there's a storm coming, let's go the other way. But we were like straight through the eye of the storm, and it was amazing.
And some of those boats had to pull out, didn't they?
Yeah, every year there's people that pulling out. I mean, there's famous stories of, just decades or so ago where they have had quite a number of fatalities in the Hobart, which is horrific. But and you kind of play those stories over in your head when you're sitting. You've got nothing else to do, sitting on a rail for hours on end. When I say the rail on the edge of the boat, you're just weight. Your weight's trying to keep the boat flat so that it will go faster, because you want to win the race.
Your life is so full of adventure. How do you cope with just normal, mundane, routine life? Family, kids, work.
Well,
I was going to say, is life a bit more calmer for you now?
Well, these stories are always sort of peppered, throughout the journey of life.
Yeah,
They're not like, it wasn't just like, oh, that was the adventure period and now there's none.
Yeah.
I'm always, to be honest with you, I'm still looking for adventure, and that's the bit I struggle with a little bit. As I've got to know who I am as I'm getting older, I realize that actually adventure is a big part of who I am, what I do, what I really strive for. And that adventure doesn't always look like being on the rail, in the ocean, or climbing a mountain, or finding myself in a dangerous situation doing a photo assignment. It could be any of those things, but I think it's really just the sense of new and discovery. I love finding new things, discovering new things, that sort of thing.
What is the heart of what drives you in everything that you do?
Well, that's a huge question, isn't it? Well, I guess it's become now more of my faith, is obviously a big part of my journey, my life, and that purpose, that sense of purpose, that sense of being unique and because
you spoke before about hearing the voice that
that's
you're
right.
moving on into another season, so that is obviously a big part of your faith as well, and your purpose and going forth into that, and that's what's led you to where you are now, isn't it? Story strategist.
Yeah, that's right. The thing that comes to mind is that we are all unique, and there was this funny moment. I'll go back, since we've talked about it, I'll go back to this particular story in the Congo that happened. We were actually at this amazing hospital, and connected to the hospital they had a chapel, and a few times a week they'd have this big service, and we were invited, myself and my friend who is the writer for this book, we were invited to go and basically attend this service and actually speak. Now, my friend, who's a writer, he's a great communicator, he's also a pastor. And so they asked him first, and then he preached. And I sat there thinking, what on earth am I going to say that could follow that? It was amazing. They had, if you've ever been to an African service, you had people jumping up all over the place, singing and cheering. It was amazing. And I was like, wow, this is awesome. I wish the world would open up and I'd get swallowed, up and disappear, because I just don't feel like I can match that or say anything, contribute to anything like that. So that's what makes me think about your question. I'm like, well, what on earth is my part in this? And in that moment, I just felt like God spoke to me again, in the spirit, said, just tell your story. And I'm thinking, what do you mean? What part of my story do you want me to tell? And as I looked in front of me, because we were sitting in front of everybody, the congregation was in front of us, I saw these mothers with their babies, because it was a hospital, right? And a lot of these mothers, their babies were in plaster because their babies were born with club feet or a club foot. And that was very common for some reason in the city. And I'd learnt that from some of the doctors we'd interviewed and so on. And I was asking them, why is it that there's like a large number of children that are born with club feet? It seems really peculiar. And they tried to explain what they thought, the theory, but they didn't have any solid facts. But I saw these mothers and their babies, and I suddenly felt God kind of say, that's it, that's your story. And this won't make sense until you hear my story. So when I was born in Reading in Berkshire, I was born with a club foot. And so a club foot, what it means is basically one of my feet was pointing in the wrong direction. It's like a birth defect that happens in the womb. The beautiful thing is that today, no worries, we can get operated on and you're all good to go. But when I was born in 1972, they'd only just started doing operations on kids at that age. If I was born 6 months earlier, I've since learned that it's highly likely that I'd be in a wheelchair today. Wow. Or maybe in crutches, but probably in a wheelchair. So, I'm thinking, where on earth would the adventure of life be if it weren't for the fact that I was born the right side of 6 months, if you like, the right side of 1972, and be in the right place where they could do this operation. And as I sat there, I looked at these women and I could see, I was like, you know what? We might be in the poorest country in the world, in one of the most dangerous cities in the world, but you've got these amazing orthopedic surgeons that are volunteering their time to work here, to train local doctors, to do operations like club feet. So I stood up and I took the microphone and I said, you know what, this is an amazing facility you have here. And I said to these ladies, I said, look, you ladies that are holding your babies, I said, you're in a good place. You're in a great place because these doctors are going to help you and they're going to help your children. And your children are going to be able to run around and jump and do everything that every child that's born with, 2 feet pointing in the right direction are born with. And I said, do you know how I can promise you that? I can promise you that because that's me. And I rolled up my trouser legs to expose my legs, because my right leg, as you can see, I know if anyone listens to the podcast will just have to use their imagination, but my right leg calf here is actually slightly thinner.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at the back of my leg, I've got a great big scar that runs up the back of my leg. That's the only evidence you'd see of the fact that I had a club foot. I can run, I can jump, and that's what I did. On the spot, I was running and jumping, and suddenly all these women jumped up with their babies and they were just ecstatic, and they were la 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 doing all this amazing singing, and I was like, far out. Thank you for giving me that story, Thank you for reminding me in that moment that I do have a place here. I may not be able to preach like my friend Jim, but that's why I'm sitting here in this place right now to
and that's
maybe
why
encourage
you value
those stories.
Story.
It is, and I love telling stories, and that's really the essence of what I feel like I'm meant to do.
And what you're doing in
And what
Story
we're doing.
Strategist.
That's right.
Yeah, it seems perfectly fit for you.
Yes.
So I think we're probably ready for some gold now.
I think we are, Ange. So, Stu, I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you more today and hearing more of your story, because as I was saying earlier, as friends, we can know a certain amount about each other, but when we actually sit and listen, we get so much more. And I see that as actually a big part of your life. Like, you have lived a story yourself, right? You've had many experiences on many different levels, extreme highs and lows, and the world has just taken you with it. You've traveled and experienced so many different cultures and people, met different people. But what has driven you the whole time has been this love of story that you have. And it's taken you into study to how to photograph people to pull out their story. You've worked with amazing people in Apple. You've gone into war-torn places, and yet you are continually looking for some deep, not just surface level stories, but you're wanting the deep story of people. And you were telling us about how you learnt how to stop and spend time before you got that photograph, and to let people open themselves up, but that takes time. So you've got that patience to wait for the true deeper level of that story as well. And that takes someone who has a real love for people. Like, that's someone who is outward looking, someone who cares and has discernment and the patience to actually draw that out of a person, and the desire to wait for that story to come out of a person. And that's the gold I see in you, is that you are this creative, you are this story chaser, and you are somebody who loves people and story enough to wait for the gold to dig deeper. So that's the gold I see in you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's amazing.
I think that moment,
Who was that person?
I was thinking of you in that moment where you gave up Apple that was a major decision in your life, to give up a thriving career that promised a future that most people would want, and you gave that up to pursue something that was uncertain, that put you in dangerous places, but to pursue something you're really passionate about, and took a lot of courage to do that. And so, for me, I see that you're doing things because you have that sense of calling and that sense of purpose to do it. And it's incredible. I love that sense of adventure about you.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, that's amazing. I feel like I've been to a therapist. Good.
I can just see, like, your whole life is just going to be this continual drawing out of stories of people, and that's awesome.
And here's a fun fact that you may not know, that, you guys would know,
Yes.
that you've actually just published a book
About your
of Stu's
stepmother.
stepmother,
Rita. She's
who has
amazing.
an incredible story, doesn't she?
Incredible.
You know, yeah, and there's a part of the kind of, I guess, what's still sitting unresolved is I've written a screenplay for a film, for a feature film, and I've got 2 other unwritten scripts, and one of them is actually to possibly look at turning the story, Rita's story, into a screenplay of some sort.
That'd
Now,
be
who knows whatever
amazing.
happens? That's as far as, you know, who knows whether that'll ever be, those things will ever be made into films. But they're sometimes just taking that first step.
So her book is called,
Though You Slay Me.
and it's really about her growing up in Liberia, isn't it? And
And just seeing
incredible.
her normal village just flip on a dime into a war-torn village from the moment she walked into a house to the moment she walked out of it. The whole outside had changed, and then she was thrown and thrust into war, and her survival of that. But
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you know, you can't imagine I mean, everybody's different, and their propensity for survival, their method of survival, or I guess their means of survival is going to be different. How they survive a situation, how they cope, is going to be different because we're all built differently, and so on. But to read Rita's story and to learn of the experiences that she has been through and survived, just makes any story that I've ever experienced, told, or whatever, pale into insignificance.
And the way she survived, like
she's
she
a
has
remarkable
come out
human being.
as the most loving, giving,
Yes.
well-adjusted person.
Yeah.
That this kind of thing, what she's been through, and you'll understand when you read it. It's probably too graphic to talk about,
Yeah.
but it would destroy people.
It would, but you know what it leaves me with, just as a sort of wrap on that point, is that you kind of wonder why. You know, some people say, especially when they discover I've got a faith, and I'm talking to friends and I love telling stories, they're like, well, why would God allow someone to go through that kind of story? Like, that seems cruel. If God's loving, why would he allow something like that to happen to somebody? Well, it's only with history, with hindsight, you know, and you allow that story to play out, that I think you can see the reason, right? If you look at Rita's reason, I would say it's because of the woman she is now.
Yeah.
And the story that she's telling today, and the way she's taken all of that experience. And she's literally just last week returned from Liberia. She's been there for the last 2 months, helping support children, trying to help sew back into her country, trying to help build and establish a new Liberia with her friends and family and you know, other Liberians to do that.
So inspirational, isn't
And
she?
that's
Yeah.
the thing. I think we
So
all
we
have
didn't
that in
mention
us.
that obviously this is your stepmom, so your dad
Yes.
and mum did eventually part
Separate,
ways.
yeah. And my mum
And-
passed away.
yeah.
She had cancer. Yeah. Quite a number
So
of years
this
ago now.
book is from your stepmother and about to be released. When's it getting released?
Probably in May.
Yeah.
I would say a May release.
Yeah. So it sounds like another fascinating story.
I read it
to-
in one sitting, by the way. I literally
It's
sat at
riveting.
home one Saturday and read the whole thing.
I still think
It's
there's
incredible.
a book ready.
It's
There's a book to
breathtaking.
come from you, Stu, as well,
Oh.
for some of your life experiences, which was great that we heard that today. So thank you for sharing your story with us
Thank you.
and joining us in the studio.
It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks
Love
for
it.
coming.
So that's it for today's podcast. You'll find us on all the major podcast platforms. The podcasts come out every Wednesday. We'd love to hear from you on our socials, the Gold Diggers Podcast. Tell us about your story so we can find the gold in you.
Easy as pie, lemon, apple or cherry. Loving you is so very sweet, sweet, sweet. How can it be such a piece of cake? And your smile is the icing. Loving you is a poem. Honey, you're my sugar.